Get out, now! Emily's voice cracked as 35 leather-clad bikers thundered into her empty parking lot, sirens screaming behind them. She had 30 seconds to decide: lock the shelter door and save herself, or open it for the men every soul in Greensburg had been taught to fear. Her hand trembled on the latch. Somewhere above her, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. If you're watching this story unfold with me, drop the name of your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The phone rang for the 4th time that morning, and Emily Carter already knew who it was before she picked it up. "Mrs. Carter, this is First Prairie Bank calling regarding your outstanding balance." "I know why you're calling." Emily's voice came out flatter than she intended, standing behind the register of a diner that hadn't seen a paying customer in 2 hours. "I told you last week I need until the end of the month." "Ma'am, we've already extended you 2 grace periods. The board is losing patience." "The board doesn't have to bury a husband and keep his diner running with duct tape and prayer." Emily snapped, then immediately regretted it. She pressed her palm against her forehead. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean..." "We understand this is difficult, but if the next payment isn't received by Friday, we will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." The line went dead before she could respond. Emily set the phone down on the counter so gently it barely made a sound, as if handling it roughly might make the conversation more real than it already was. She looked around the diner, the chipped formica tables, the cracked vinyl booths, the faded photograph of her and Daniel standing in front of the very first grill they'd bought secondhand from a restaurant closing in Wichita. 12 years of their life sat inside these 4 walls. 12 years, and it was about to become someone else's parking lot. "You okay, Miss Emily?" The voice belonged to 16-year-old Tyler, the only part-time cook she could still afford to pay, and even then barely. "I'm fine, Tyler." She forced a smile that fooled no one. "Just the bank being the bank." Tyler didn't push. He'd learned not to. Instead, he nodded toward the window. "Sky looks weird today. Real green." Emily glanced outside. He was right. The clouds had taken on a strange sickly color, heavy and low, pressing down over the flat Kansas horizon, like a lid closing on a pot about to boil over. "Probably just heat building up," she murmured, though something in her stomach disagreed. She didn't know yet that within the hour that green sky would tear her entire world apart and somehow impossibly put it back together in a way she could never have imagined. By noon, the radio in the kitchen crackled with an update that made Tyler's face go pale. National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for Kiowa County, effective immediately. Residents are urged to seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Emily's hands froze mid-wipe on the counter. "Miss Emily," Tyler's voice had lost its usual teenage nonchalance. "That's us. That's right here." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted almost involuntarily to the framed photo of Daniel again. He was the one who built the storm shelter behind the diner years before, back when everyone in town teased him for being overly cautious. "You never know, Em," he used to say, hammering another support beam into the ground. "Kansas doesn't warn you twice." She hadn't understood then how right he'd been about the storms and about so many other things. The sirens outside began to wail, long and mournful, cutting through the humid afternoon air, like a warning from the earth itself. "Tyler, go home, now. Your mom's probably already panicking." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I've got the shelter. Go before the roads get bad." Tyler hesitated only a second before bolting out the back door, nearly tripping over a chair in his haste. Emily watched him disappear down the gravel road on his bike, pedaling as if his life depended on it, because at that moment it might have. She turned off the stove, unplugged the register, and grabbed her small emergency bag from beneath the counter. Just as she was about to step outside, she caught her reflection in the dark window glass. A 39-year-old woman, hollow-eyed, exhausted, standing alone in a diner, about to be repossessed, about to be flattened by a storm the news was already calling potentially historic. "Wonderful," she muttered to no one. "Just wonderful." She had no idea that comment would become almost darkly funny in hindsight. The wind hit her first, not gradually, but all at once, like a wall slamming into her chest the moment she stepped outside. Dust and loose gravel swirled violently across the empty parking lot. The sky had gone from sickly green to a deep, bruised black veined with lightning that flickered without any accompanying thunder, as if the storm itself were holding its breath. Emily ran toward the shelter, her sneakers slipping on the gravel, heart hammering. That's when she heard it. Engines, dozens of them, a deep guttural roar that seemed to rise from the ground itself, growing louder with each passing second, cutting straight through the howling wind. She turned around confused, half expecting a National Guard convoy. Instead, she saw motorcycles, not one, not five, an entire wave of them roaring down the empty highway and swerving hard into her parking lot headlights, slicing through the darkening storm like desperate flares. 35 bikes, 35 riders, all wearing the unmistakable patches of the Hells Angels. Emily's stomach dropped. Every warning she'd ever heard about that name flooded her mind at once. Every rumor, every headline, every whispered story passed around town like gospel. Dangerous, violent, criminals. Stay away, and now they were parking directly in front of her, dozens of them, dismounting in a chaos of leather and boots shouting over the wind. "Ma'am." A massive man with a gray beard and a scarred jaw jogged toward her, both hands raised in a gesture that was somehow both threatening and desperate at once. "We need shelter now. That thing's coming straight for us." Emily's mind screamed at her to run, to lock herself inside and pretend she never saw them. Every instinct told her these were dangerous men, exactly the kind her late husband would have told her to avoid. But then she looked past him, past the leather vests and the tattoos and the intimidating patches, and saw something else entirely. Fear. Raw, unmistakable human fear plastered across the faces of 35 bikers who had nowhere else to go. A woman near the back, maybe in her 30s, was clutching a young girl no older than 7, both of them soaked and trembling. A younger man limped, blood already soaking through the sleeve of his jacket from a piece of flying debris. An older rider knelt on the ground, hyperventilating, hands pressed against his ears. These weren't monsters. These were people, terrified people seconds away from disaster. The wind screamed louder. Somewhere behind the darkness, a freight train roar began to build the unmistakable sound every Kansas native knew and dreaded. "Ma'am, please!" The gray-bearded man shouted again louder, this time more desperate. "We don't have much time." Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She thought of Daniel, of everything he stood for, of the sign that used to hang above the diner counter before it faded and fell. "Everyone eats here. No exceptions." She thought of the bank foreclosure, of the tornado, of 35 strangers who might die in her parking lot in the next 60 seconds if she chose fear over compassion. And in that instant, with the world literally roaring apart around her, Emily Carter made a decision that would alter the rest of her life. "This way," she screamed, pointing toward the shelter door. "Everyone move now." Chaos exploded around her as 35 bikers sprinted toward the underground shelter, boots pounding against gravel wind, howling loud enough to swallow their shouts. "Watch the kid! Watch the kid!" someone yelled as the frightened mother stumbled, nearly dropping her daughter. Emily rushed forward, instinctively catching the little girl's arm before she fell. "I've got her! Go, go, go!" The mother's eyes met Emily's for a split second, wide, tearful, disbelieving that a stranger, a woman who had every reason to slam the door in their faces, was instead pulling her daughter to safety. "Thank you," the mother gasped. Thank you, thank you. Oh, just move," Emily shouted, ushering her toward the shelter entrance. The injured rider stumbled past next, clutching his bleeding arm, face pale from shock. Emily grabbed his good shoulder and steadied him. "Almost there. Stay with me." "Why are you helping us?" he grunted through gritted teeth. "You don't even know us." Emily didn't answer immediately. The wind nearly ripped the words from her mouth before she managed to shout back, "Because it's the right thing to do. Now move." One by one, they poured into the shelter. Leather vests soaked with rain, faces streaked with dust, and fear boots slipping on the metal steps leading underground. Emily counted heads as they passed her, an old habit from years of running a diner and making sure every customer was accounted for. 30, 31, 32. The freight train roar behind her grew deafening. 33, 34. "Come on!" she screamed at the gray-bearded man who was practically dragging the panicking older rider toward the door. 35. The moment the last biker crossed the threshold, Emily threw herself inside and slammed the heavy steel door shut, spinning the internal lock with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The sound outside became something Almost otherworldly, a deep guttural roar that seemed to press against the very walls of the shelter, rattling dust from the ceiling, drowning out every voice inside. 35 hardened bikers, one terrified diner owner, all crammed into a shelter built for 12, and above them a monster tornado, tearing the only life Emily had left into pieces she couldn't yet imagine. Inside the cramped concrete room, the air was thick with fierce sweat and the metallic smell of blood from the injured rider's arm. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The only sound was the storm above, an apocalyptic roar that made the entire shelter tremble like a tin can in a giant's fist. Emily's eyes adjusted to the dim emergency lighting. 35 faces stared back at her, some hardened, some frightened, all of them for the first time looking at her not as an enemy or a stranger, but as the person who had just saved their lives. "Everyone accounted for?" the gray-bearded man asked, his booming voice slightly softer now. 35, Emily confirmed, still catching her breath. "That's everyone." A tense silence followed, broken only by the muffled cries of the little girl still clutched tightly against her mother's chest. "Shh, baby, it's okay," the mother whispered, rocking her gently. We're safe now." Emily crouched slightly, catching the woman's eye. "What's her name?" "Lily," the mother answered, voice trembling. "I'm Sarah. My husband's... He's out riding with the group. I don't even know if he made it." "He's here," a voice interrupted. A younger biker near the back raised his hand slightly. "Mike's fine, Sarah. He's 2 feet from you. He's just too stubborn to say he's scared." A ripple of tension broke just slightly as a tall man with a shaved head and a nervous laugh raised a hand sheepishly. "I'm not scared. I'm cautious." Despite everything, despite the storm roaring above them like the end of the world, Sarah let out a small, broken laugh, pulling Lily closer. Emily allowed herself the briefest exhale of relief before her attention snapped toward the injured rider, still clutching his bleeding arm. "Let me see that," she said firmly, kneeling beside him. "It's fine," he grunted, though his pale face betrayed the truth. "It's clearly not fine. Let me see it." Reluctantly, he extended his arm. A jagged gash ran along his forearm, still bleeding steadily, clearly cut by flying debris just before he reached the shelter. "I need something to stop the bleeding," Emily said, glancing around. "Anyone have a first aid kit? A clean cloth? Anything?" A woman near the back, the only other female biker in the group, immediately reached into her jacket and pulled out a small emergency kit. "Here, always carry one on long rides." "Perfect, thank you." Emily took the kit quickly, unwrapping gauze and pressing it firmly against the wound. "This is going to hurt." "Everything today hurts," the injured man muttered through clenched teeth, but he didn't pull away. As Emily worked wrapping the wound tightly, the gray-bearded man watched her closely, arms crossed, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You a nurse?" he asked finally. "No," Emily said, tying off the bandage. "Just someone who's had to patch up a lot of kitchen accidents over the years." "Could have fooled me." Emily managed a tired smile. "Guess adrenaline makes anyone look competent." For the first time since they'd burst into her parking lot, something shifted in the massive man's expression, the faintest flicker of respect. "Name's Jack," he said. "Jack Walker. Most people call me Titan." Emily studied him for a moment, the scars, the graying beard, the sheer size of him that could have crushed her without effort. And yet in that dim underground shelter, all she saw was a man who had just been as terrified as everyone else moments before finding safety. "Emily," she said simply. "Emily Carter." "Well, Emily Carter," Titan said, voice low and steady despite the chaos roaring above them. "You didn't have to open that door." "No," Emily agreed quietly. "I didn't." "Then why did you—" The tornado screamed above them, shaking dust from the ceiling, drowning out conversation for several seconds. When it quieted just enough to speak again, Emily looked directly into Titan's eyes. "Because 35 people were about to die in my parking lot," she said simply. "And I couldn't live with it myself if I let that happen just because of what patch was sewn onto your jackets." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then quietly from the corner of the shelter, the older rider who had been hyperventilating earlier, the one suffering the panic attack, began gasping again, his breathing rapid and shallow hands pressed hard against his temples. Can't breathe. It's too small in here, too small." Emily was moving before she even consciously decided to. She crouched in front of him, blocking his view of the cramped walls, speaking in the same calm, steady voice she used to use on Daniel during his worst nights after his diagnosis. Hey, hey, look at me. Not the walls. Me. The man's wide, panicked eyes locked onto hers. What's your name? D. Danny, he stammered. Okay, Danny, I need you to breathe with me. In for 4 seconds. Can you do that? He nodded weakly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now hold it. And out slow 5 seconds. Danny's breathing, ragged and desperate at first, gradually began to slow, matching the rhythm of Emily's steady counting. Around them, the other bikers watched in stunned silence as this stranger, this woman, who had every reason to fear them instead, guided one of their most hardened members through the worst moment of his life with nothing but patience and a steady voice. You're doing great, Danny. Almost there. After several more rounds, Danny's breathing finally steadied. He looked up at Emily, eyes glassy with exhaustion and something like gratitude. Thank you, he whispered hoarsely. Nobody's done that for me before. Emily squeezed his shoulder gently. Everybody deserves someone to breathe with them sometimes. Titan watched the entire exchange without a single word, his expression unreadable in the dim shelter light. But something in his eyes had changed, something deep. Something that would matter far more than Emily could possibly have understood in that moment. The tornado raged above them for what felt like both seconds and an eternity. 28 minutes, though nobody inside the shelter would have guessed anything less than hours. The walls shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling in sporadic bursts. Somewhere above, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass and splintering wood confirmed what everyone already feared: their world outside was being torn apart piece by piece. Emily sat pressed against the concrete wall, Lily's small hand unexpectedly slipping into hers at some point during the worst of it. The little girl looked up with wide, frightened eyes. Is the monster going to eat our house? Emily's chest tightened, but she kept her voice calm. There's no monster, sweetheart. Just wind. Really, really strong wind. Will it stop? It always stops, Emily whispered, though her own heart wasn't entirely convinced. Storms always stop eventually. Sarah, watching the exchange, mouthed a silent thank you over her daughter's head. Nearby, two younger bikers, who'd clearly been strangers before this moment, found themselves in quiet conversation, gripping each other's forearms every time the shelter shuddered particularly violently. You got family out there, man, one asked. Sister, 2 nephews. You. Just my old man. He's tougher than this storm, though. Aren't we all pretending to be right now? A weak, nervous laugh passed between them, the kind of laugh that exists only to keep panic at bay. Titan, meanwhile, had positioned himself near the shelter door, arms crossed, jaw tight, listening to the chaos above, with the focused intensity of a man calculating exactly how much of his life was currently being destroyed. Emily noticed his stillness and, despite everything, found herself moving toward him. You okay? She asked quietly. Been better, Titan admitted, voice low. Got 20 years riding with these people. Never seen most of them scared like this. They're allowed to be scared. So are you. Titan glanced sideways at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. You always this calm during the apocalypse. Emily let out a short, humorless laugh. Trust me, I am nowhere near calm. I'm just very good at hiding it. Run the diner business for 12 years, you learn to smile through anything. Diner, Titan repeated slowly. Yours out there. Emily's throat tightened unexpectedly. Yeah, 12 years. Built it with my husband before he passed. Something shifted in Titan's expression, recognition perhaps, or something closer to shared grief. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and for the first time it didn't sound like empty politeness. It sounded like a man who understood loss intimately. Before Emily could respond, the entire shelter shook violently, dust exploding from the ceiling, as something enormous crashed directly above them. Several bikers cried out. Lily screamed, burying her face into her mother's chest. Danny's breathing spiked again, though this time another rider quickly moved beside him, quietly repeating the counting technique Emily had used minutes earlier. In for 4. You got this, man. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs as she instinctively reached out, gripping Titan's massive forearm without thinking. He didn't pull away. If anything, his stance shifted slightly, subtly positioning himself between Emily and the shelter door, as if some deep protective instinct had activated despite everything. That was close, he muttered. Too close, Emily whispered back. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody spoke. The world above continued its violent, deafening destruction, and 36 strangers pressed together in the darkness, bound by nothing but fear, and the desperate hope that the next few minutes wouldn't be their last. And then almost as suddenly as it began, the roar began to fade. Slowly, painfully slowly, the freight train's scream above them softened into a distant howl, then a whisper, then finally an eerie, exhausted silence. Nobody moved for nearly a full minute, as if collectively afraid that any sound might invite the monster back. Finally, Titan broke the silence, voice hoarse. I think it's over." Emily released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding the entire time. "I think you're right." Slowly, cautiously, the bikers began rising to their feet, helping each other up, checking for injuries, exchanging exhausted, disbelieving glances. Danny wiped tears from his eyes, looking at the stranger who'd stayed beside him. "We made it. We made it," the stranger echoed, clapping his shoulder. Sarah kissed the top of Lily's head over and over, whispering thanks to whatever force had kept her daughter safe. Titan turned toward Emily, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between gratitude, awe, and quiet disbelief. "Emily Carter," he said slowly, "you have no idea what you just did." Emily managed a tired, trembling smile. "I just opened a door, Jack." Titan shook his head slowly, his voice dropping to something almost solemn. "No," he said, "you did a lot more than that." Emily didn't understand what he meant, not fully, not yet. She had no way of knowing that this single decision, made in 60 desperate seconds during the worst storm of her life, would soon set into motion something far larger than she could ever have imagined. Because when Emily finally worked up the courage to unlock that shelter door and step outside into the aftermath, she would discover that everything she owned, every wall, every table, every memory of the life she'd built with Daniel, had vanished completely. The diner was gone, and somewhere deep inside her, though she didn't know it yet, so was the last shred of hope she had left. Orchestrated, emotionally driven narrative. With dialogue-heavy pacing and strategic mini-climaxes throughout. Orchestrated, emotionally driven narrative with dialogue-heavy pacing and strategic mini-climaxes throughout. The silence after the storm was almost louder than the storm itself. For nearly a full minute, nobody in the shelter moved. Boots stayed planted on concrete. Breath came out in shallow, disbelieving gasps. Titan finally reached for the heavy steel lock, his scarred hand hesitating over the lever, like he was afraid of what waited on the other side. "You ready?" he asked, glancing back at Emily. "No," she admitted, "but we can't stay down here forever." He turned the lock. The door groaned open, and the first thing that hit them wasn't sight, it was smell. Wet earth, splintered pine gasoline, and something sharper underneath it all. Something that smelled like a life being erased. Titan climbed the steps first, shoulders squared, the instinct of a man used to walking into danger before anyone else. Emily followed close behind Lily's small hand still wrapped around two of her fingers, refusing to let go even now that the roar had stopped. When Emily's eyes adjusted to the gray afternoon light, her knees nearly buckled. There was nothing, not damaged, not knocked over, nothing. The diner, the booths, the counter, the grill Daniel had hauled in from Wichita on the back of a borrowed truck, the faded sign that used to read, "Everyone eats here," all of it was simply gone, scattered somewhere across 3 counties, reduced to a slab of concrete foundation and a few twisted pipes jutting up from the earth like broken fingers. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered behind her, pulling Lily tighter against her hip. Emily didn't say anything. She couldn't. Her mouth opened and no sound came out because there were no words sized correctly for what she was looking at. 12 years. Every dish she'd ever washed, every order she'd ever called back to Daniel in the kitchen, every late night spent balancing books at that counter after closing vanished in 28 minutes. "Emily," Titan's voice quieter now, careful. "You okay?" "That's my whole life," she said, and her voice cracked in a way she hated. That was my whole life." One of the younger bikers, the one who'd been chatting nervously about his sister and nephews, stepped up beside the wreckage and let out a long breath. "Man, I've seen tornado damage before. Never seen it wipe a building down to nothing like that. She built a shelter that saved 35 of us." Another rider muttered almost to himself, staring at the rubble. "And her own place got flattened like it was made of paper." The unfairness of it sat in the air like smoke. Danny, still pale, still shaken from his panic attack underground, walked slowly toward the concrete slab, crouching down and running his palm across the cold surface like he was trying to make sense of it with his hands, since his eyes clearly couldn't. "You saved us," he said, not looking up. "You saved 35 strangers, And this is what you come back to. Storms don't check who deserves what, Emily said quietly. They just take. Nobody argued with that. For several minutes, the group simply stood in the gray light, surveying the wreckage in silence. The kind of silence that exists only after something enormous has happened, and everyone is still trying to figure out how to keep breathing normally. Then Sarah's voice broke it softer than before. Emily is there. Anyone you need to call family, someone who can come help. Emily's throat tightened. No family close by. It was just me and Daniel who built this place. He passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. Me too, Emily said, and for the first time since stepping out of the shelter, her voice wavered dangerously close to breaking completely. Titan noticed. He always noticed things like that. A man who'd spent decades reading rooms full of tension, learning who was 2 seconds from cracking and who could hold. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Hey, look at me. Emily turned eyes glassy. You didn't lose everything, Titan said. 35 people are standing here breathing because of you. That's not nothing. That's not close to nothing. It doesn't pay the mortgage, Jack. No, he admitted. It doesn't. The honesty of that answer, no false comfort, no empty platitude, hit Emily harder than any reassurance could have. She appreciated it more than she expected to. That's when the first sirens reached them from a distance, emergency vehicles working their way down the ruined county road, picking through debris scattered across what used to be pavement. We should let them know everyone's accounted for, Titan said, already moving toward the road, waving his arm high to flag down the first approaching truck. While he did, the group began quietly organizing themselves, checking on each other, tending to smaller cuts and bruises, the injured rider from earlier wincing as he flexed his bandaged arm. Bandage held, he said, almost surprised. Didn't think it would. I've had practice, Emily said, managing a small, tired smile despite everything. Kitchen accidents. Told you. Guess I owe you twice now. You don't owe me anything. Ma'am, he said more seriously this time. With respect, I think that's exactly the problem. You keep saying that like it's true. Emily didn't have an answer for that. A county rescue truck rolled to a stop near the wreckage, and 2 exhausted-looking first responders climbed out, eyes widening slightly, at the sight of 35 leather-clad bikers standing amid tornado debris next to a woman who was clearly the property owner. Everyone all right here? The older responder asked, cautiously glancing between the group with an expression that suggested he wasn't quite sure what he was walking into. Everyone's fine, Emily said quickly. They took shelter with me. We're all accounted for. The responder's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise flickering across his face, but he nodded, professional courtesy taking over. That's good. That's real good. We've got reports of damage all through the county. You folks are lucky. Lucky, Emily repeated softly, glancing at the concrete slab that used to be her entire world. The responder either didn't catch the bitterness in her voice or chose not to address it. We'll get a damage assessment team out here in the next day or 2. In the meantime, is there somewhere you can stay, ma'am? Emily opened her mouth, and for a moment nothing came out because the honest answer was no. She didn't have anywhere. Her apartment was the small room behind the diner that no longer existed either. Titan answered before she had to. She's got people, he said, simply nodding toward the group of bikers around them. The responder glanced between them again, clearly puzzled by the dynamic, but didn't push further. All right, we'll be back through. Y'all stay safe. As the truck pulled away, Emily turned to Titan, brow furrowed. I don't have people, Jack. You do now, he said, for today at least. That single sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in Emily's chest, a small, unexpected warmth in the middle of devastation. Over the next hour, something strange and unexpected began happening. Despite having their own bikes to check their own injuries, to nurse their own families, to call the 35 bikers didn't simply disperse. Instead, several of them began quietly clearing debris from around the concrete slab, dragging splintered wood and twisted metal into piles, careful not to disturb what might still be salvageable underneath. You don't have to do that, Emily said, watching 2 of them haul a shattered section of the counter out from under a collapsed support beam. We know, one of them grunted, not stopping. Doing it anyway. Sarah knelt near the edge of the slab, sifting carefully through debris, and suddenly straightened, holding something up. Emily, is this? Emily's breath caught. It was the photograph, the one of her and Daniel in front of that second-hand grill, The frame cracked, the glass shattered, but the photo itself somehow impossibly intact. She took it with trembling hands, running her thumb across the edge of the frame. That's Daniel. That's us, the day we opened. It survived, Sarah said softly. Everything else didn't, but that did. Emily stared at the photo for a long moment, feeling something crack open in her chest. Not devastation this time, but something closer to disbelief that anything at all had made it through. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Sarah said. You saved my daughter's life today. Finding one photograph doesn't come close to evening that out. Nearby, Danny approached carrying something else, a small, dented metal box, the kind used for cash registers. Found this wedged under what's left of the counter. Locked, but it's still got weight to it. Emily took it, hands shaking harder now. That's the emergency cash box. Daniel kept it for... She stopped, throat tightening. For emergencies just like this, apparently. Guess he planned ahead, Danny said quietly. He always did, Emily whispered, more than I gave him credit for. The moment stretched heavy with memory until Titan's voice cut through gentler than expected. We should get moving soon. Storm's clear, but there's more weather building west. Don't want to get caught out here again. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes quickly, embarrassed at how close she'd come to falling apart in front of 35 strangers, who 24 hours ago she would have crossed the street to avoid. As the bikers began preparing, their motorcycles checking tires, wiping debris off seats, helping each other clear branches from where the bikes had been parked, Emily found herself standing near Titan, watching the group with a strange hollow ache building in her chest. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. We've got people waiting on us, families, chapters expecting us to check in. Titan's voice was steady, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the timing either. We don't just disappear on people, Emily. Same reason you didn't lock that door. I understand, she said, and she did. Even something inside her quietly protested the idea of watching them ride away and being left alone with a slab of concrete and a cracked photograph. Titan studied her for a long moment. You gonna be okay? I don't know, Emily admitted more honestly than she intended. I don't have insurance that's active. I don't have savings. I don't have a diner. I don't really know what okay looks like right now. Something flickered behind Titan's eyes. Calculation maybe, or the early formation of a thought he wasn't ready to voice yet. You did something today most people wouldn't have done, he said slowly. Opened a door for strangers everyone told you to fear while your own world was falling apart. That's not something that just evaporates, Emily. That matters, more than you know right now. It doesn't fix anything, she said quietly. No. Titan agreed. Not today, it doesn't. The way he said it, not today, carried a strange weight Emily couldn't quite place, but she didn't have the energy left to examine it closely. One by one, engines roared to life around them, the deep rumble that had terrified her hours earlier, now oddly comforting, familiar even. Sarah approached last. Lily balanced on her hip, the little girl's cheeks still streaked from the earlier chaos. Say bye to Miss Emily, Sarah prompted gently. Lily reached out with small arms, and Emily, without thinking, leaned down and hugged her. Bye, Miss Emily, Lily said solemnly. Thank you for saving us from the monster. Emily's eyes welled instantly. You're very welcome, sweetheart. Sarah squeezed Emily's shoulder. I don't know how we ever repay this. You don't have to, Emily said. Just take care of her. Always, Sarah said, voice thick. Danny stopped next, offering an awkward, uncertain hand. Emily shook it, and he pulled her into a brief, firm hug instead. Nobody's ever talked me down like that before, he said quietly. Not once. Not in 20 years of dealing with this. Thank you. Any time, Emily whispered. The injured rider passed last, flexing his bandaged arm carefully. Guess I'll be thinking of you every time this scar itches. Despite everything, Emily managed a real laugh. That's oddly comforting. It's meant to be. Finally, only Titan remained standing beside his motorcycle, studying Emily with an expression she still couldn't fully read. You're a hell of a woman, Emily Carter, he said finally. You're not exactly what I expected either, Jack Walker. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Most people never bother finding out what to expect. They just believe the patch. I almost did too, Emily admitted quietly. Almost. But you didn't. No, she said, I didn't. Titan swung on his bike engine, growling to life beneath him. And for a moment, he simply looked at her. Really looked the way someone looks at another person they suspect they might not see again, but desperately hope they're wrong about. "Take care of yourself," he said finally. "You too." And then one by one the motorcycles pulled out onto the ruined highway, engines echoing across the flattened landscape until the entire group disappeared into the gray horizon, leaving Emily standing completely alone beside a concrete slab that used to hold her entire life. She watched until she couldn't hear the engines anymore. Then she watched a while longer just in case. The silence that followed was worse than any storm. Emily sat down slowly on the edge of the concrete slab, cradling the cracked photograph and the dented cash box in her lap, staring out at debris scattered as far as she could see, splintered fence posts, torn roofing, a stop sign bent completely in half, 50 yards away. For the first time since the sirens had gone off that morning, she allowed herself to cry. Not the controlled, quiet tears she'd fought back in front of the bikers, but real, ugly, shoulder-shaking sorrows that came from somewhere far deeper than the tornado, somewhere that had been cracking slowly since Daniel's diagnosis, since his funeral, since every phone call from the bank that reminded her exactly how alone she really was. "Miss Emily." She looked up sharply. Tyler stood at the edge of what used to be the parking lot bike, dropped haphazardly in the gravel, face pale with shock as he took in the wreckage. "Tyler." Emily wiped her face, hastily standing. "You should be home. I had to check on you." His voice cracked. "Miss Emily, it's all gone. The whole diner's just gone." "I know," Emily said quietly. "What happened?" "I saw a bunch of motorcycles out here earlier from the road, big group of them, and I thought—" He stopped, confusion crossing his young face. "Wait, were those the Hells Angels people said they came through town right before the storm hit?" "They took shelter with me," Emily said simply, "in Daniel's storm shelter." Tyler's eyes widened. "You let them in?" "I did." "Miss Emily, everyone says those guys are—" "They're people, Tyler," Emily interrupted more sharply than she intended. "Scared people who needed help, same as anyone else would have been. Same as you would have been." Tyler fell silent, clearly processing this new information against everything he'd grown up hearing. Did they do anything, take anything?" "They saved a photo," Emily said, holding it up, "and a cash box. And honestly, Tyler, if anything, they helped me more today than they took." Tyler looked at the wreckage again, then back at Emily. Something shifting behind his young eyes, the early formation of a lesson he'd likely carry for the rest of his life. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Emily looked out over the ruined lot at the twisted pipes and shattered concrete at the horizon, where 35 motorcycles had disappeared only an hour before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I really don't know, Tyler." That night, Emily stayed in the ruins longer than she should have, sitting on an overturned cooler someone had dragged out of the debris wrapped in a blanket a neighbor had brought over after hearing the news. The stars came out slowly above the wreckage, indifferent and distant, and for a long time Emily simply sat there, replaying the entire day in fragments that refused to arrange themselves into any coherent order. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Hello? Mrs. Carter. This is Riverside Insurance calling regarding your claim inquiry." Emily's stomach tightened instantly. "Yes, I need to file for tornado damage. My business was completely destroyed this afternoon." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that never preceded good news. "Mrs. Carter, I'm showing here that your commercial policy lapsed 3 weeks ago due to non-payment. I'm very sorry, but without an active policy at the time of the incident, we're unable to process a claim." The words hit like another gust of wind, knocking whatever fragile balance Emily had left completely off its foundation. "There has to be some mistake," she said, voice barely steady. "I paid that policy. I know I did. I'm showing a missed payment in May, ma'am. The policy was canceled after the 60-day grace period." Emily closed her eyes, doing the math, even though she already knew the answer. May, the month Daniel's final hospital bill had come due. The month she'd had to choose between insurance and medication. "So there's nothing," she whispered. "I'm very sorry, Miss Carter. You may qualify for FEMA disaster assistance, but I'd encourage you to apply as soon as possible given the scale of damage in the area." The call ended. Emily sat in the darkness, phone still pressed against her ear long after the line went dead, staring at the skeleton of concrete and pipe that used to be everything she'd built with the man she loved. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The wind, gentler now, rustled through debris scattered across the ruined field. Emily Carter, 39 years old, widow former business owner, now sat alone in the wreckage of her entire life, believing with absolute certainty that this was rock bottom. She had no way of knowing that 4 days later, the ground beneath that same ruined lot would begin to tremble again, not from another storm, but from something far larger, far louder, and far more impossible than anything she could have imagined, sitting there in the dark, utterly convinced that opening that shelter door had cost her everything she had left. For now, all she could do was pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders, clutch the cracked photograph against her chest, and whisper into the empty night the only words that felt true. "I don't know what to do next, Daniel," she said softly. "I really don't." The wind didn't answer. Nothing did. But somewhere on a highway 200 miles away, 35 motorcycles were pulling into a gas station, and Jack Titan Walker was already reaching for his phone, dialing a number that hadn't been called in months, about to set in motion something Emily Carter couldn't possibly have predicted. Orchestrated narrative escalation. FEMA shortfall, banking pressure, biker arrival, climax. Orchestrated narrative escalation. FEMA shortfall, banking pressure. Biker arrival climax. The phone call ended, but Emily didn't move from the overturned cooler for a long time. When she finally did, it was only because the cold had worked its way through the blanket and into her bones, and some stubborn part of her refused to let a tornado do to her body what it had already done to her diner. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She stayed at a neighbor's spare room, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in her head that never came out right, no matter how many times she rearranged them. By morning, the numbers hadn't gotten kinder. "Mrs. Carter, I've got your FEMA application pulled up here," the caseworker said over the phone, her voice polite but rushed clearly, one of hundreds of calls she was fielding that week. "Based on the damage assessment and your documentation, you're approved for individual assistance." Emily sat up straighter. That's good. How much?" "Initial disbursement is $2,100 with potential for additional housing assistance pending further review." Emily closed her eyes. $2,100 against a mortgage balance that ran well into six figures, against equipment costs, against a business that no longer existed in any form except a slab of concrete and a photograph that had survived by accident. "That's it?" she asked quietly. "I understand that feels small compared to the scope of damage, ma'am, but it's meant to bridge immediate needs housing essentials while other resources come through." "What other resources?" "Small business administration loans are available, though those require repayment. Some residents have had luck with community fundraising." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. I wish I had better news for you." Emily thanked her out of habit more than sincerity and ended the call sitting on the edge of the borrowed bed in the borrowed room, feeling smaller than she had in years. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. She flinched, half expecting another piece of bad news dressed up in professional courtesy. Instead, it was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "This is Sarah from the shelter. Wanted to check on you. How are you holding up?" Emily's throat tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't expected anyone to check in. Certainly not this soon. "Not great," she typed back honestly. "Insurance denied the claim. FEMA barely covers a used mattress. Bank's still calling." The reply came fast. "That's not right. None of that is right. Storms don't check who deserves what," Emily wrote, echoing her own words from the day before, though they felt heavier typed out than spoken. "They just take." There was a longer pause before Sarah's next message arrived. "Titan's been asking about you. A lot, actually. Don't be surprised if you hear from him." Emily frowned slightly at her phone, unsure what to make of that, and set it aside without responding, too exhausted to unpack whatever it meant. She had no idea that 400 miles away in a clubhouse she'd never seen on a phone call, she'd never hear Jack Titan Walker, was already speaking words that would change everything. "You're telling me a woman opened her shelter to 35 of us in the middle of a killer tornado, patched up Marcus's arm, talked Danny down from a full panic attack, and then lost her entire business in the process?" The voice on the other end of Titan's phone belonged to Raymond Preacher, Cole National Road Captain, a man who'd ridden with the Angels for nearly 30 years and had heard every kind of story there was to hear on the road. "And you're telling me this now, why?" "Because it's not right, Ray," Titan said, standing outside a gas station 2 states away, watching his breath fog slightly in the cool evening air. She had nothing to gain helping us, everything to lose if you want to get technical about it, and she did it anyway. So what exactly are you asking for? Titan hesitated only a second. I want to put it to the chapters, all of them. See what we can raise. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that made Titan wonder if the call had dropped. You know what you're asking? Preacher finally said. That's not a local collection jar, Jack. That's a national call. I know exactly what I'm asking. Word gets out about this, people are going to ask why. Going to want the full story. Then we give them the full story, Titan said firmly. Every bit of it. Woman didn't ask who we were before she opened that door. Didn't care about patches or reputation or 30 years of headlines. She saw people who needed help and she helped them. That's the story. That's all of it. Another pause, shorter this time. You really believe in this one, huh? Titan glanced back toward the highway, toward the direction they'd ridden from 2 days earlier, toward a ruined diner and a woman standing alone amid its wreckage. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. All right, Preacher said finally. I'll make some calls. But Jack, if we're doing this, we're not doing it small. We do this, we do it right. Wouldn't have it any other way. The call ended, and Titan stood alone outside the gas station for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, already picturing something he hadn't dared say out loud to Preacher, something far bigger than a simple chapter collection, something that felt less like an idea and more like an inevitability now that it had taken root in his mind. He pulled his phone back out and began scrolling through contacts he hadn't touched in years. Chapter presidents in California, Texas, Florida, Ohio, men and women he'd ridden beside at funerals, weddings, charity runs, and everything in between. By the end of that night, 43 phone calls had been made. By the end of the week, that number had multiplied into hundreds. Back in Greensburg, Emily had no idea any of this was happening. Her days had collapsed into a grim, repetitive rhythm. Waking in a borrowed bed, drinking coffee she couldn't really afford, driving past the wreckage of her diner because some masochistic part of her needed to see it every morning, as if daring herself to believe it had all been a bad dream. It never was. On the fourth day, the calls from the bank became more frequent and more pointed. Mrs. Carter, this is David Ferris calling from First Prairie Bank. We spoke last week regarding your account. I remember, Emily said flatly, sitting at her neighbor's kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of her. In case you missed the news, Mr. Ferris, my business was destroyed in a tornado 4 days ago. I'm aware, and the bank extends its sympathies. However, that doesn't change the outstanding balance on the property loan. You can't be serious. Mrs. Carter, the bank has been more than patient. Given the current circumstances, we're prepared to offer a resolution that avoids formal foreclosure proceedings, which would be far more damaging to your credit long term. Emily's grip tightened around her coffee mug. What kind of resolution? A voluntary transfer of the property deed to the bank in exchange for forgiveness of the remaining loan balance and settlement of associated fees. It would allow you to walk away clean without a foreclosure mark on your record. You want me to just give you the land? It's currently non-productive land with no structure remaining on it, Mrs. Carter. Frankly, it's a generous offer given the circumstances. Something in his tone, smooth, rehearsed, entirely too comfortable, made Emily's stomach twist. Why does the bank suddenly want a piece of dirt with a broken foundation on it? There was the briefest hesitation on the line, almost imperceptible, but Emily caught it. The bank evaluates all distressed properties for potential resale value, Ferris said carefully. That's simply standard procedure. Emily didn't believe him for a second, but she was too exhausted, too broken down by 4 sleepless nights and a lifetime of financial exhaustion to fight the instinct clawing at the back of her mind that something wasn't adding up. I need time to think about it, she said. Of course, though I'd encourage you not to wait too long. These offers don't remain on the table indefinitely. The call ended, and Emily sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the wall, feeling the walls of her life closing in from every direction at once. 2 days later, Ferris showed up in person. Emily was standing at the edge of the ruined lot when his sedan pulled up, dust kicking up behind polished tires that looked deeply out of place against the wreckage surrounding them. He stepped out in a pressed suit folder tucked under one arm, expression arranged into practiced sympathy. Mrs. Carter thought it might be easier to discuss this in person. I told you I needed time, Emily said, arms crossed against the wind, and I understand that. But I also have to be honest with you. The offer I mentioned has a narrow window. I'd hate to see you lose the opportunity for a clean resolution. Clean for who exactly? Ferris's smile faltered slightly. For you, Mrs. Carter, truly. Emily studied him for a long moment, exhaustion warring with the last flickers of stubborn pride Daniel had loved so much about her. What if I don't sign? Then the bank proceeds with formal foreclosure, which, as I mentioned, carries far more serious consequences for your credit and financial future. Frankly, given your current circumstances, I don't see many other paths forward. The word helpless wasn't spoken aloud, but Emily heard it clearly enough beneath his careful phrasing. She thought about the insurance denial, the FEMA check that wouldn't cover a month's rent, the 4 sleepless nights, the mounting exhaustion of fighting battles that seemed designed specifically to be unwinnable. Show me the papers, she said quietly. Ferris's expression brightened instantly, opening the folder and producing a pen with practiced efficiency sliding both across the hood of his car toward her. This is simply a voluntary transfer agreement, he said. Sign here and here, and the bank will handle everything else. Emily's hand hovered over the pen. Every instinct in her body screamed that something about this was wrong. The urgency, the specific interest in worthless-looking land, the practiced smoothness of a man who clearly wanted this signed before she had time to think too carefully. But exhaustion is a powerful thing. It wears down instinct until surrender starts looking a lot like relief. Daniel would know what to do here, she whispered to herself, barely audible over the wind. Daniel always knew what to do. She picked up the pen. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the tip against the paper, beginning to trace the first letter of her signature. That's when the ground began to vibrate. At first it was subtle, a faint tremor beneath her feet, easy to dismiss as nothing more than a passing truck on the distant highway. Emily paused, pen still touching paper, listening. The vibration grew stronger. Mrs. Carter, Ferris asked, noticing her hesitation, clearly annoyed at the delay. Is something wrong? Do you feel that? Emily asked slowly, lifting the pen away from the paper entirely now. Ferris frowned, glancing around. Feel what? The tremor intensified, no longer subtle, no longer easy to dismiss. Emily's mind flashed instantly to 4 days earlier, the same rising vibration, the same sense of something enormous approaching from a distance. Oh God, she whispered. Not again. Please, not another one. She scanned the horizon frantically, searching for the telltale green-black sky that had preceded the tornado, half expecting to see another wall cloud forming in the distance. Instead, she saw something entirely different. Headlights. Not one, not two. An entire horizon full of them stretching along the highway as far as she could see, growing brighter closer, accompanied by a deep rolling rumble that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with engines. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them, a sound so massive it seemed to rise up from the earth itself. What in the... Ferris turned toward the highway, his professional composure cracking slightly as the sound grew louder, more overwhelming with each passing second. Emily stood frozen, pen still clutched uselessly in her hands, staring at a wall of light and sound that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, growing larger, closer, undeniable. Mrs. Carter, what exactly is happening right now? Ferris demanded, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing too fast to form words, cycling through possibilities that felt too impossible to voice out loud. The rumble became a roar. The roar became deafening. And then, cresting the small rise along the county highway, the first motorcycles came into view, dozens, then hundreds, then more than Emily could possibly count, an unbroken river of chrome and leather stretching back farther than her eyes could track, filling the entire highway from shoulder to shoulder. That's not possible, Emily whispered, pen slipping from her fingers entirely now, falling forgotten onto the gravel below. The first riders began turning into what remained of her parking lot engines, idling down into a low rumbling growl. Dozens of bikes at first, then dozens more, then more, still filling every available inch of space and continuing to pour in from the highway in an endless, overwhelming procession. Ferris took an involuntary step backward, his polished shoes scuffing against gravel, his earlier confidence entirely gone, now replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. Mrs. Carter, who exactly are these people? Emily's eyes were fixed on the front of the procession, on a familiar, massive figure dismounting from his motorcycle, removing his helmet to reveal a graying beard and a scarred jaw she recognized instantly. Titan, she breathed. He walked toward her with steady, purposeful strides, expression unreadable. Beneath the low afternoon light, while behind him, motorcycles continued arriving in waves that showed no sign of stopping, not hundreds now, but clearly climbing well beyond that, an almost unbelievable, unbroken chain of riders, still visible, cresting the distant highway. Jack, Emily said, voice barely above a whisper, "What is this? What's happening?" Titan's eyes flicked briefly to Ferris, to the folder of papers still resting on the hood of the sedan, to the pen lying abandoned in the gravel, and something hardened almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Looks like we got here just in time," he said quietly. "Just in time for what?" Ferris demanded, stepping forward with the last remnants of his professional bravado. "Sir, this is private business between the bank and Mrs. Carter. I'll have to ask you and your associates to clear the area." Titan turned toward him slowly, and though his voice remained perfectly calm, something in it carried an unmistakable weight that made Ferris take another involuntary step back. "You want to run that by me again?" Titan asked. Real slow this time. Ferris's mouth opened, then closed, clearly recalculating the situation in real time as more motorcycles continued arriving behind Titan, 100 more than 200, filling every available space of the ruined lot and spilling out along both shoulders of the highway. This is a private financial matter," Ferris managed, though his voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. "Funny," Titan said, "because from where I'm standing, it looks a whole lot like a bank trying to pressure a grieving widow into signing away land 4 days after she nearly died, protecting 35 strangers from a tornado." "That about right, Emily." Emily, still stunned, nodded slowly. "That's about right." Titan's eyes never left Ferris. "So maybe you want to explain to me real slow, like I said, why exactly a bank is in such an all-fired hurry to grab a worthless slab of concrete out from under a woman who just lost everything." Ferris's composure finally cracked entirely. That's confidential banking information. I'm not authorized to." "Convenient," Titan said flatly. Behind him, the endless procession of motorcycles continued arriving, engines idling in a low, thunderous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. Emily watched still, barely able to process what she was witnessing, as rider after rider dismounted, removing helmets, revealing faces from every corner of the country, men and women of every age, every background, wearing patches from chapters she'd never even heard of. "Jack," she said quietly, voice trembling now for entirely different reasons than exhaustion or grief. "How many people did you call?" Titan glanced back at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like genuine emotion flickered openly across his weathered face. "Every chapter east of the Rockies," he said, "and a few west of them too, apparently, judging by that Nevada plate I just saw roll through." "That's Jack, that's not possible. That's not—" 2,500, Titan said quietly, "give or take a few dozen who are still en route." Emily's knees genuinely threatened to give out beneath her. 2,500 people, she repeated, barely able to form the words. 2,500 people came here. "For me." "For what you did?" Titan corrected gently. "There's a difference, and it matters. You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was right." This, he gestured toward the endless sea of motorcycles and riders now filling every visible inch of the ruined property and stretching back along the highway. "This is just people making sure the world knows that kind of thing doesn't go unanswered." Ferris, forgotten momentarily in the overwhelming scale of what was unfolding, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Carter, perhaps we should reschedule this conversation for—" "No," Emily said, turning toward him with a sudden, fierce clarity that surprised even herself. "No, Mr. Ferris, I think we should finish this conversation right now. In fact, I think I'd like you to explain to everyone here exactly why First Prairie Bank is so desperate to get their hands on a piece of destroyed property that, according to you, has no value." A murmur rippled through the nearest riders, low and dangerous, dozens of eyes turning toward Ferris with sudden focused attention. That information is proprietary," Ferris stammered, sweat visible on his forehead, now despite the cool afternoon air. "Try again," Titan said quietly. Ferris's eyes darted between the endless sea of riders surrounding him, clearly recalculating just how thoroughly the balance of power in this conversation had shifted in the last 5 minutes. There's been interest," he finally admitted, voice tight, "from a logistics company, cross-country trucking. They're looking to build a distribution hub along this corridor, and this property sits at a critical junction point. They've offered the bank a substantial acquisition price well above the outstanding loan balance. The words hung in the air like a confession, which in every way that mattered they were. "So you weren't doing me a favor," Emily said slowly, understanding, crystallizing with each word. "You were trying to steal my land out from under me for pennies on the dollar before I found out what it was actually worth." That's an aggressive characterization. "It's an accurate one," Titan interrupted flatly, "and I think you know it." Ferris said nothing, his silence answering more clearly than any words could have. Emily looked down at the abandoned papers still resting on the hood of his sedan, then back up at Ferris, something hardening in her expression that hadn't been there in years, not since Daniel's funeral, not since the bank's first threatening call, not since she'd started believing deep down that she simply didn't have the strength left to fight for anything anymore. "I'm not signing anything today," she said clearly, loud enough for the nearest riders to hear. "Not today, and not on terms designed to cheat me out of what this land is actually worth." Ferris's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Carter, without a resolution, the bank will have no choice but to proceed with formal foreclosure." "Then proceed," Emily said, voice steadier than she'd felt in days. "Because I guarantee you, Mr. Ferris, foreclosing on a property with 2,500 witnesses watching a bank representative attempt to defraud a widow 4 days after a tornado is going to look a whole lot different in a courtroom than whatever quiet little transfer you were hoping for." A low murmur of approval rippled through the surrounding crowd, and for the first time since arriving, Ferris looked genuinely thoroughly rattled. I'll need to discuss this with the board," he said stiffly, gathering his papers with hands that weren't entirely steady. "You do that," Titan said, "and maybe mention to your board that we've got about a dozen members here who happen to practice law when they're not riding. Might want to loop them in too, if this ends up going the direction you are threatening." Ferris didn't respond. He simply retreated to his sedan, sliding in quickly and pulling away with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived, with tires kicking up gravel as he merged awkwardly into a gap between parked motorcycles before disappearing down the highway. Emily watched him go, hand pressed against her chest, heart still pounding from the sheer velocity of everything that had just happened in the span of 10 impossible minutes. "Jack," she said, finally turning back toward him, voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't fully name. I don't understand any of this. Why would this many people come here for me, for a door I opened because it was the right thing to do?" Titan studied her for a long moment, the endless sea of riders behind him falling into a respectful, watchful silence waiting. "Because in 20 years of riding with this club," he said slowly, "I've watched a whole lot of doors close in our faces. Diners that wouldn't serve us, motels that wouldn't rent to us, towns that posted signs telling us to keep moving. We've gotten used to it, learned to expect it even." He paused, glancing back at the massive crowd behind him before continuing. "And then a woman who had every reason in the world to slam that door in our faces, a woman who was about to lose everything, who had every excuse imaginable to protect herself, first opened it instead. Didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, just opened it because 35 scared people needed somewhere safe to be." His voice roughened slightly. "That's rare, Emily. Rarer than you probably realize. And when something like that happens, word travels fast in this world. Every chapter I called, I didn't have to convince anybody twice. They heard the story once and started loading trailers." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She no longer had the strength to fight back. "Trailers." Titan's expression shifted slightly, something almost like amusement flickering behind the emotion. "Yeah, about that." He gestured behind him, and Emily's eyes followed his hand toward the back of the seemingly endless procession, where she could just make out through the sea of motorcycles, massive flatbed trailers beginning to arrive, loaded high with lumber, stacked pallets of building materials, and equipment she couldn't fully identify from this distance. "Jack," she said slowly, disbelief cracking her voice entirely now. "What did you do?" "Made some calls," he said simply. "Talked to some people. Turns out this club's got more electricians, carpenters, contractors, and retired engineers than most construction companies twice our size." "You're not," Emily's breath caught entirely. "You can't possibly be saying what I think you're saying." Titan's expression softened into something Emily hadn't seen from him before: quiet, unguarded certainty. "Emily Carter," he said, You opened one door for 35 strangers during the worst storm this county's seen in decades. Today, 2,500 of us are here to make sure that decision doesn't cost you everything you built with your husband. Emily's legs finally gave out entirely, and she sank slowly onto the concrete slab behind her. The same slab where she'd sat crying alone in the dark only days before, staring up at a wall of motorcycles and lumber, and strangers who weren't strangers anymore, completely unable to process the scale of what was unfolding in front of her. She started, voice breaking completely now. I don't know how to thank 2,500 people. Titan crouched down slightly beside her, voice gentling further. You don't have to thank us, Emily. You already did the thing that mattered. Now it's our turn. Behind him, the first flatbed trailer rolled to a careful stop near the edge of the ruined foundation, and a weathered gray-haired man climbed down from the driver's seat, surveying the wreckage with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades building things with his hands. This the site, he called out toward Titan. This is it, Titan confirmed. The man nodded slowly, already pulling a tape measure from his belt, moving toward the concrete slab with quiet, focused purpose. Foundation looks solid enough. We can work with this. Emily watched, still too stunned to fully speak, as more trucks began arriving behind the first flatbeds, loaded with steel beams. Generators, rolls of wiring, stacks of roofing material, still wrapped in plastic from the supplier. How? She finally managed, voice barely a whisper. How is any of this even possible? This much material, this fast? You'd be amazed what 2,500 people with connections to every hardware supplier and lumberyard between here and the Mississippi can pull together in 4 days. Titan said, a faint smile finally breaking through his weathered features, especially when they're motivated. And you did this, Emily said slowly, looking up at him, because I opened a door. No, Titan corrected, gently shaking his head. We're doing this because you reminded a lot of hardened, cynical people what it looks like when somebody does the right thing without expecting anything back. That's worth more than any door, Emily. That's worth this. Emily looked out at the sea of motorcycles. The arriving trailers, the workers already beginning to organize into groups, discussing measurements and materials with the easy competence of people who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. And for the first time in 4 devastating days, something Emily hadn't felt since before Daniel's diagnosis, since before the bank's first threatening call, since long before the tornado had torn her entire life apart, in 28 merciless minutes began cautiously, carefully returning to her chest. Hope. Real, undeniable, overwhelming hope, rising up out of the wreckage, exactly where despair had been sitting only moments before. She looked up at Titan, tears streaming freely down her face now, and asked the only question that mattered. Where do we start? Titan's smile widened, genuine and warm for the first time since she'd met him. Wherever you want, Emily Carter, he said. This is your diner. We're just here to help you build it back. Behind them, 2,500 engines fell silent one by one, replaced by the sound of truck doors opening, tools being unloaded, and the low, steady hum of thousands of people preparing to spend the coming weeks turning a widow's destroyed dream into something even stronger than it had been before. Orchestrated narrative arc to Sungdot Ngân hàng đến Khai Trương Hoàn Trang. Orchestrated narrative arc to Sungdot Ngân hàng đến Khai Trương Hoàn Trang. The gray-haired contractor's name was Earl, and within 20 minutes of stepping off his flatbed, he had already claimed the hood of his truck as an impromptu drafting table, sketching foundation measurements across a yellow legal pad, while 3 other men leaned over his shoulder, arguing good-naturedly about load-bearing walls. You want the kitchen where the old one was, or are you thinking bigger? Earl asked, glancing up at Emily without looking up from his sketch. Emily blinked. I hadn't thought that far ahead. 20 minutes ago, I thought I was signing my land away. Well, you're not, Earl said simply. So think about it now. This foundation's solid, but there's no reason we can't extend it 8-10 feet if you want more seating. Titan says you were running that place solo most nights. More space means more help, means less of you working yourself into the ground. The casual practicality of it, the assumption that, of course, they'd build it bigger, of course, they'd build it better, nearly broke Emily's composure all over again. I don't have the money for bigger, she admitted quietly. Earl finally looked up, weathered face creasing into something between amusement and gentle reproach. Ma'am, look behind you. Emily turned. Behind her, more trailers were arriving by the minute, unloading pallets of lumber, rolls of electrical wire, stacks of drywall still wrapped in plastic. A group of riders had already formed a human chain, passing materials hand to hand, with the practiced efficiency of people who'd clearly done this before for other people in other towns after other disasters. Money's not really the obstacle here today, Earl said. Time and vision are. So, bigger or the same footprint? Emily looked at the concrete slab, small, familiar the shape of 12 years of memory, and then at the crowd of thousands still filling the highway in surrounding fields waiting for direction, waiting to build something with their hands for a woman most of them had never met. Bigger, she said, voice steadier than she expected. Daniel always wanted to add a back room for private parties. Never had the money. Earl grinned, already scratching new lines onto his legal pad. Now we're talking. By the second day, the transformation had become almost impossible to comprehend. What had been a bare concrete slab now bore the skeletal outline of framed walls, steel support beams rising where the old wooden ones had been, a footprint noticeably larger than the original structure, exactly as Earl had sketched. Emily walked the site each morning in a state of perpetual disbelieving wonder, watching electricians run conduit through walls that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier, watching roofers measure trusses with a precision that made her old contractor, the one Daniel had hired for the original build over a decade ago, look almost amateur by comparison. "You've done this before," she said to a woman named Denise, who was currently running wire through a junction box with practiced, confident hands. "This exact thing, rebuilding after disaster. More times than I'd like," Denise admitted, not looking up from her work. "Hurricane relief in Louisiana, flood rebuild in Missouri, wildfire recovery out in California year before last. This club has been doing disaster rebuilds for going on 15 years now. Most folks don't know that part. They just see the leather and the bikes and assume the worst. How many builds like this have you done?" Denise considered the question seriously. "Personally, maybe a dozen. Club-wide, lost count somewhere past 50. Emily sat with that number for a long moment, feeling something in her understanding of the world quietly shift and resettle into a new, more accurate shape. "Why doesn't anyone know about this?" she finally asked. Denise finally looked up, an expression carrying the weariness of someone who'd answered this question more times than she cared to count. "Because Bikers Rebuild Disaster Victims Home doesn't sell papers the way Biker Gang Causes Trouble does. Nobody puts a camera on us hammering nails. They put a camera on us when something goes wrong at a bar 3 states away. That's just how it's always been." The unfairness of it sat heavy in Emily's chest, made heavier by the fact that 4 days ago, she herself had almost believed the same headlines Denise was describing. "I'm sorry, Pamela," Emily said quietly. "I almost didn't open that door. I want you to know that. Every warning I'd ever heard was screaming at me not to." Denise's expression softened slightly. "But you did anyway. That's the part that matters, Emily. Doesn't matter what you almost did. Matters what you actually did when it counted." Before Emily could respond, a commotion near the front of the property drew both their attention, raised voices, the low murmur of a crowd gathering, and underneath it, a voice Emily recognized instantly, tight with barely controlled anger. Ferris was back. This time he hadn't come alone. 2 additional men in similarly pressed suits flanked him, along with a uniformed county official carrying a clipboard, and Emily's stomach dropped at the sight a local news van parked haphazardly at the edge of the property. "Mrs. Carter," Ferris's voice had lost its earlier smoothness, replaced by something clipped and defensive. "I need to speak with you regarding unauthorized construction occurring on bank-collateralized property." "It's not bank-collateralized," Emily said, walking toward him with a confidence that surprised even herself. "The loan is still active. The bank doesn't own this property, I do. The bank holds a lien against this property which gives us significant interest in any structural modifications or improvements. Are you seriously trying to stop people from rebuilding my diner?" Emily's voice rose sharp enough that several nearby workers paused tools, lowering slightly as attention shifted toward the confrontation. "I'm simply here to ensure all parties understand the legal complexities involved," Ferris said stiffly. "Unpermitted construction on collateralized property could constitute a violation of loan terms, which the bank would be well within its rights to. Permits are being pulled." Earl's voice cut in the older contractor, stepping forward, with the legal pad still tucked under one arm, entirely unbothered by the suits or the county official. "Filed electronically yesterday morning. County office confirmed receipt an hour ago. Everything here is being done to code inspected as we go fully permitted. Ferris's confidence flickered visibly. That seems unusually fast for permit approval. County's motivated to help disaster victims rebuild quickly, the uniformed official interjected, speaking for the first time, his tone carrying an edge of something almost like amusement, especially when the applicants got 2,500 extra hands ready to work the second the paperwork clears. Made my job pretty easy, honestly. The news reporter, sensing the shifting dynamics, stepped closer with her cameraman trailing behind microphone, already extended toward Ferris. Sir, can you clarify for our viewers exactly why First Prairie Bank is attempting to halt reconstruction efforts for a tornado victim who lost her business less than a week ago? Ferris's face reddened instantly. We're not attempting to halt anything, we're simply ensuring. Mr. Ferris came to my property 4 days ago. Emily interrupted, turning directly toward the camera, voice steady despite her racing heart, and pressured me into signing away my land for pennies on the dollar, while withholding the fact that a trucking company had already offered the bank a price far above what I actually owed. I didn't sign, and now apparently the bank would rather stop me from rebuilding than admit they got caught trying to take advantage of a grieving widow. The reporter's eyes widened slightly, clearly recognizing a much bigger story than the one she'd arrived expecting to cover. Is that true, Mr. Ferris? She asked, microphone swinging back toward him. Ferris opened his mouth, closed it, and glanced desperately toward his two silent colleagues who offered no assistance whatsoever, clearly having decided in real time that this particular fire was not one they intended to stand near. That characterization is, Ferris stammered, sweat visible on his brow despite the cool morning air. The bank simply evaluates all options available for distressed properties. Convenient options that happen to benefit a trucking company willing to pay well above market value. Titan's voice cut through the tension, the massive biker having appeared at some point during the exchange, arms crossed expression, carrying a quiet, dangerous calm. Funny how that particular option never made it into your first conversation with Emily. Ferris's colleagues exchanged a brief, uncomfortable glance. Perhaps one of them finally spoke up, voice carefully neutral. It would be prudent for the bank to revisit its position on this account, given the circumstances. You think, Titan said flatly. The reporter, sensing blood in the water, pressed further. Mrs. Carter, given everything that's happened, what would you like to see from First Prairie Bank moving forward? Emily took a breath, steadying herself, feeling the weight of thousands of watchful eyes around her, bikers, workers, county officials, and now potentially an entire regional television audience. I'd like the loan restructured to reflect fair market value of the land without the pressure tactics, she said clearly. And I'd like an apology, though frankly I'm not holding my breath on that one. A ripple of laughter moved through the surrounding crowd, breaking the tension slightly. Ferris's silent colleague cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, I believe we can arrange a meeting to discuss appropriate restructuring terms. I apologize for any miscommunication that occurred during initial conversations. That's not an apology, Titan muttered, just loud enough for the nearest microphone to catch it. The reporter smiled slightly, clearly delighted with the segment forming in real time. This has been an incredible story unfolding here in Kiowa County. We'll definitely be following up as this develops. As the bank representatives retreated toward their car, Ferris cast one final glance back at the property, at the framed walls rising rapidly behind Emily, at the endless rows of motorcycles, at the sheer scale of what was clearly no longer a fight he could win, before climbing into the sedan and pulling away without another word. The moment the car disappeared down the highway, the entire crowd erupted into applause, and cheering tools raised triumphantly into the air, engines revving in celebration. Emily stood in the middle of it, tears streaming freely now, completely overwhelmed by a moment that 4 days earlier she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Titan stepped up beside her, voice gentler now beneath the surrounding celebration. You did that, not us. You stood right up to him. I had 2,500 people standing behind me, Emily said, laughing through her tears. Made it a lot easier to be brave. That's usually how it works, Titan said quietly. Nobody's brave completely alone. Everybody needs somebody standing behind them sometimes. You just forgot you were allowed to ask. Over the following days, the construction pace accelerated into something Emily could barely track. Walls rose. Roofing went up in sections, precise and efficient. The back room Daniel had always dreamed of, the one for private parties, for community gatherings, for exactly the kind of celebration currently unfolding around its own construction began taking shape exactly as Earl had sketched. Local residents, initially watching from a cautious distance, began drifting closer each day, curiosity slowly overcoming decades of ingrained suspicion. "You mind if we help?" a middle-aged man asked one afternoon, standing awkwardly at the edge of the property with two teenage sons in tow. Emily recognized him vaguely, Roger Higgins owning the hardware store 2 towns over. Someone who'd occasionally stopped in for coffee, but never much more than that. "Roger," Emily said, surprised. "Of course, we could use the extra hands." Roger glanced nervously at the nearest group of bikers who were currently laughing over some shared joke while hoisting a support beam into place. "Gotta admit, wasn't expecting to spend my Saturday working alongside the Hells Angels." "Neither was I," Emily admitted. "Turns out preconceptions don't hold up too well once you actually get to know people." Roger's oldest son, maybe 17, was already staring with undisguised fascination at the nearest motorcycle, a gleaming custom build with intricate flame detailing along the tank. "That's a beautiful bike," the boy said almost involuntarily. The biker standing nearby, a woman named Cassie, who Emily had learned specialized in electrical work, glanced over smiling slightly at the boy's obvious admiration. "Built it myself, took the better part of 2 years." "You built that yourself?" the boy asked, eyes widening. "Every bolt," Cassie confirmed. "Want to see the engine work?" The boy glanced at his father, who after a moment's hesitation nodded. Within minutes, the teenager was crouched beside Cassie, peppering her with questions about carburetors and torque specs, decades of ingrained stereotype dissolving in real time under the simple weight of shared enthusiasm. Roger watched the exchange, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. "Guess I had some things wrong," he admitted quietly to Emily. "Most of us did," Emily said, myself included 4 days ago. By the end of that week, what had started as a cautious trickle of local volunteers had transformed into a steady stream. Teachers, shop owners, retired farmers, teenagers looking for something to do during summer break, all working alongside bikers from chapters spanning the entire country, the strange, unlikely combination somehow functioning with remarkable seamless efficiency. It was during the second week that Emily received the call that nearly knocked the wind out of her entirely. "Mrs. Carter, this is Patricia from First Prairie Bank's regional office. I'm calling regarding the restructuring of your account." Emily braced herself instinctively, old exhaustion rising automatically despite everything that had changed around her. "All right, what's the news?" "Given the circumstances brought to our attention and following an internal review, the bank has decided to fully forgive the remaining loan balance on your property, effective immediately." Emily sat down heavily on an overturned bucket near the construction site phone, pressed hard against her ear. "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" "The loan balance is forgiven, Mrs. Carter, in full. Additionally, the bank would like to extend a formal apology for the conduct of our representative during initial conversations, along with a contribution toward your rebuilding efforts as a gesture of goodwill." "A contribution?" Emily repeated numbly. $25,000 transferred directly to an account of your choosing. Emily's hand trembled so hard she nearly dropped the phone entirely. "Why the sudden change of heart?" There was a pause on the line, followed by something that sounded suspiciously like discomfort. "Mrs. Carter, the story regarding your situation has gained significant regional attention following the news segment last week. Combined with several formal complaints regarding our representative's initial conduct, the board determined that a resolution reflecting fairness and good faith was in the bank's best interest." Translation. Emily understood immediately they'd gotten caught, and the bad press had cost them far more than the loan balance was worth. "I appreciate the resolution," Emily said carefully, "though I hope you understand it doesn't erase what almost happened." "I understand completely, Mrs. Carter. And again, I apologize on behalf of the institution." The call ended, and Emily sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the phone in her trembling hands, before looking up to find Titan watching her from several yards away, having clearly caught enough of the conversation to guess at its contents. "Loans forgiven," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Completely forgiven. Plus $25,000. Titan's weathered face broke into a broad, genuine grin. "Well, look at that." "How?" Emily said, standing on unsteady legs. "How did this happen?" The news story, the bank suddenly caring about fairness, might have had something to do with about 6,000 angry comments on that news station's social media page. Titan said, not quite meeting her eyes. And maybe a formal complaint filed with the State Banking Commission by a few of our members who happen to have law degrees they don't use much these days. You did this, Emily said, understanding dawning. We just made sure the right people were paying attention, Titan said simply. The rest was on the bank and fixed once they realized how bad this looked. Emily felt tears rising again, a now familiar sensation over the past 2 weeks, though these tears carried an entirely different weight than the ones she'd cried alone in the dark, clutching a cracked photograph beside a pile of rubble. Jack, she said quietly, I don't know how I'm ever going to repay any of this. The building, the loan, all of it. Titan's expression turned serious, gentler than she'd seen from him before. Emily, you're not keeping score here. Nobody is. You did something extraordinary when it mattered most without expecting anything in return. This, he gestured toward the rapidly rising structure behind them, toward the hundreds of workers still moving with steady, purposeful energy across the property. This isn't a transaction. It's just people recognizing goodness and choosing to answer it. By the third week, the building had transformed entirely larger, sturdier, and unmistakably beautiful, in a way the original diner, for all its sentimental value, had never quite managed to be. The back room Daniel had always dreamed of stood complete windows overlooking the same flat Kansas horizon that had once brought a killer tornado roaring toward this exact spot. Emily stood in the center of the nearly finished dining room, running her palm along a newly installed counter, not the same one Daniel had hauled from Wichita all those years ago, but something Earl and his crew had built by hand, using reclaimed wood salvaged from local barns, damaged in the same storm, each plank carrying its own small history of survival. You've been quiet today, Titan observed, appearing beside her, as he often did now, having stayed through the entire rebuild despite Emily insisting more than once that he didn't need to. Just thinking about Daniel, Emily admitted, wondering what he'd say if he could see this. What do you think he'd say? Emily considered the question seriously, running her hand along the reclaimed wood counter one more time. He'd probably ask why it took a tornado and 24 bikers with law degrees to finally get the back room built. Titan laughed, a genuine warm sound that had become increasingly familiar over the past 3 weeks. Sounds like a man with priorities. He was, Emily said softly. He really was. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the new windows as workers outside began installing the final section of signage above the entrance, a design Emily had sketched herself, incorporating elements of the old diner alongside something entirely new. You never did tell me, Titan said eventually, what you're calling it. The new place. Emily smiled, something warm and certain, settling into her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. Come see, she said, leading him toward the entrance. The finished sign, freshly painted, caught the afternoon light as workers secured the final bracket into place. Beneath the restaurant's name in smaller, careful lettering ran 4 words Emily had insisted on including from the very first day of planning. Kindness is never wasted. Titan read it silently, something shifting behind his weathered eyes. Emily, he said quietly, that's about the truest thing I've read in a long while. Feels appropriate, Emily said, given everything. Below them in the parking lot that had once held 35 terrified bikers seeking shelter from a killer storm, workers were already beginning preparations for something else entirely. Long folding tables, strings of lights, the early foundations of what would become in just a few more days the largest celebration Greensburg, Kansas had witnessed in generations. Emily watched the preparations with a growing sense of anticipation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, unaware that the grand opening awaiting her would draw far more attention and far more emotion than she could possibly have imagined standing there in that quiet, hopeful afternoon light. The morning of the grand opening, Emily woke before her alarm, heart already pounding with a nervous energy she hadn't felt since the day she and Daniel had first unlocked the doors of the original diner 12 years and 1 lifetime ago. You ready for this? Sarah's voice came through the phone, warm and familiar, after weeks of daily check-ins that had turned into something closer to real friendship. Ask me again in 6 hours, Emily said, pacing the small kitchen of the apartment she'd finally been able to rent above the hardware store thanks to the bank settlement. I keep thinking something's going to go wrong. Feels too good to be true. Nothing's going wrong, Sarah said firmly. Titan's had this plan down to the minute. Man's more organized than most event planners I've met. Speaking of Titan, Emily said, unable to keep the small smile out of her voice, he's been oddly quiet the past few days. Every time I ask what's happening with the ceremony, he just says, "You'll see." Sounds like Jack, Sarah laughed. Man loves his surprises almost as much as he loves pretending he doesn't have a sentimental bone in that giant body of his. Emily laughed despite her nerves, though something in Sarah's tone made her wonder exactly what surprise was waiting for her. She had no idea just how right that instinct would turn out to be. By 10 that morning, the parking lot that had once sheltered 35 terrified strangers, then hosted 2,500 motorcycles, now overflowed with an entirely different kind of crowd. Families from Greensburg and surrounding counties, local business owners, county officials, and reporters from 3 different news stations, all gathering beneath a beautiful clear sky that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the storm that had started this entire journey. Emily stood near the entrance, smoothing down her dress for what felt like the 100th time, watching the crowd swell with a mixture of excitement and lingering disbelief. Nervous, Earl's voice came from beside her, the contractor looking uncharacteristically formal in a pressed shirt instead of his usual work clothes. Terrified, Emily admitted it. In a good way, I think. Good terrified is the best kind, Earl said, patting her shoulder, with the same rough affection he'd shown throughout the entire rebuild. Building turned out beautiful, Emily. Damn proud of what we made here. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Without all of you. That's kind of the whole point, Earl said simply. Nobody builds anything worth having completely alone. Before Emily could respond, a low, familiar rumble began building in the distance. Not the overwhelming roar of 2,500 motorcycles, but something smaller, more measured, growing steadily louder as it approached. Titan appeared at her side, freshly shaved, wearing a clean vest that still somehow managed to look exactly like him, despite the formal occasion. "You look terrified," he observed, echoing Earl's earlier assessment. "Everyone keeps telling me that's a good thing today." "It is," Titan confirmed. "Means it matters. Come on. Time to cut that ribbon." Emily allowed herself to be led toward the entrance, where a bright red ribbon stretched across the new doorway, the freshly painted sign gleaming above it in the midday sun, "Kindness is never wasted," catching the light exactly as she'd imagined it would. The crowd fell into an expectant hush as Emily took her place beside the ribbon-oversized ceremonial scissors, feeling absurd and wonderful in her trembling hands. "Before I cut this," she said, voice carrying across the crowd with a confidence she'd rediscovered somewhere over the past 3 transformative weeks, "I want to say something." The crowd waited patient and attentive. "5 weeks ago, I thought my life was ending," Emily continued, throat tightening despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I'd lost my husband, I was about to lose my business, and then a tornado took the only thing I had left standing. I made a choice that day to open a door for 35 strangers everyone told me to fear. And I want you all to know that choice didn't just save their lives. It saved mine too in ways I couldn't have possibly understood at the time." She glanced toward Titan, standing slightly apart from the crowd expression, carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was trying very hard not to show emotion in front of 2,000 witnesses. "This building isn't just a diner," Emily continued. "It's proof that kindness finds its way back to you, even when you least expect it, even when it seems like the whole world is falling apart. So thank you to every single person who picked up a hammer, wired a socket, framed a wall, or simply showed up to prove that judgment based on appearance is the emptiest kind of judgment there is." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emily, tears now flowing freely, despite her earlier resolve, raised the ceremonial scissors and cut through the ribbon in one clean motion. The doors swung open behind her, revealing the finished dining room in all its reclaimed wood sunlit glory, and the crowd surged forward with a collective energy that Emily could feel in her bones. That's when Titan stepped forward, raising a hand for quiet, and Emily realized with sudden nervous clarity that whatever surprise Sarah had hinted at was about to arrive. "Before everyone heads inside," Titan announced, voice carrying easily across the crowd, "there's one more thing that needs to happen here today." Emily turned toward him, confusion evident on her face. "Jack, what?" "Emily," Titan said, turning fully toward her, now something unusually vulnerable flickering behind his weathered features. "When we first met, you told me you opened that door because you couldn't live with yourself if you let 35 people die in your parking lot over what patch was sewn onto their jackets." "I remember," Emily said softly. "What you didn't know," Titan continued, "is that decision put something in motion that goes a lot further than one rebuilt diner. He nodded toward the crowd, and Emily watched stunned as Sarah stepped forward, carrying Lily, followed by Danny, followed by Denise and Earl and Cassie, and dozens of familiar faces from the original 35, all gathering in a loose semicircle around her. The national chapters took a vote 3 weeks ago, Titan said. Wasn't even close, honestly. We're establishing a permanent fund, the Carter Fund they're calling it, whether you like the name or not, dedicated specifically to disaster relief rebuilding for small business owners who lose everything and don't have anywhere else to turn. Every chapter contributes annually. Every disaster we respond to going forward carries your name attached to it. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, tears now impossible to control entirely. Jack, that's too much. That's so much more than... It's exactly enough, Titan interrupted gently, because what you did wasn't small, Emily. It just felt small to you because you were the one doing it. But from where we're standing, you didn't just open a door for 35 people. You opened a door for every person this fund is ever going to help for years, maybe decades after today. The crowd around them had fallen completely silent, absorbing the weight of what was unfolding, and Emily found herself surrounded by faces she'd grown to consider genuine friends over the past 3 transformative weeks, every one of them watching her with open, unguarded emotion. I don't know what to say, Emily whispered. You don't have to say anything, Sarah said, stepping forward with Lily still balanced on her hip. You've already said everything that mattered 5 weeks ago in about 60 seconds during the worst storm any of us had ever seen. Lily, now considerably less shy than during the terrifying hours in the shelter, reached out toward Emily with small, insistent arms. Emily took her instantly, holding the little girl close, overwhelmed by an emotion too large and complicated to properly name. Miss Emily, Lily said solemnly, Mommy says you're a hero. Emily's voice cracked completely now. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I just opened a door. That's what heroes do, Lily said with the simple, unshakable confidence that only children seem to possess. They open doors when everyone else is too scared to. The crowd, having heard the little girl's words carry clearly across the suddenly quiet lot, erupted into fresh applause, several people visibly wiping away tears of their own. Czekam. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening tables, groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by half the county motorcycles and pickup trucks, parked side by side in a configuration that would have seemed impossible 5 weeks earlier. Emily moved through the crowd in a daze of gratitude, stopping every few feet to embrace someone new. Roger Higgins and his sons, now regular fixtures at the construction site, turned regular customers before the diner had even officially opened. Denise, who'd promised to return for the diner's 1-year anniversary. Earl, who'd already started sketching plans for an outdoor patio addition on a fresh legal pad, despite Emily's protests that the current building was more than enough. Near sunset, she found herself standing beside Titan at the edge of the property, looking back at the glowing windows of the finished diner packed with customers laughing and eating and celebrating in a way the original building had rarely, if ever, witnessed. Never seen a grand opening quite like this, Titan admitted, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Never had a grand opening built by 2,500 bikers before, Emily replied, laughing softly. Fair point. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, the same kind of silence that had settled between them dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, familiar now in a way that would have seemed impossible on the day they'd first met, standing terrified in a parking lot as a tornado bore down on them both. Jack, Emily said finally, can I ask you something? Always. That day in the shelter when you asked me why I opened that door, I gave you an answer, but it wasn't the whole truth. Titan turned toward her, curious. What was the whole truth? Emily considered her words carefully, watching the last light of the day catch against the new sign above the diner entrance. The whole truth, she said slowly, is that I'd spent 2 years since Daniel died convinced I had nothing left worth protecting. The diner was failing. I was drowning in debt. I genuinely believed my life had stopped mattering the day he passed. And then 35 people showed up needing help, and for the first time in 2 years, I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone else. That's why I opened the door, Jack. Not because I was being noble, because saving you all reminded me I still had something worth giving. Titan was quiet for a long moment, processing the raw honesty of her admission. You know what's funny? He said eventually. I think most of us needed the exact same reminder. Spent years getting told what we were by people who never bothered finding out the truth. You didn't just save our lives that day, Emily. You reminded a whole lot of hardened people that we were still capable of receiving kindness from someone who owed us absolutely nothing. Seems like we saved each other, then, Emily said softly. Seems like it, Titan agreed. 6 months later, the diner had become something far larger than Emily could have imagined during those desperate, terrifying days following the tornado. Word of the story had spread well beyond Kiowa County, drawing curious visitors from across the state, eager to see the place where 35 bikers had sheltered from a storm and 2,500 more had returned to rebuild what the tornado destroyed. But more than the curiosity, more than the increased business, what mattered most to Emily was what happened every year on the anniversary of that first terrifying storm. The first annual kindness ride drew nearly 4,000 riders that inaugural year. Hells Angels chapters from across the country, alongside local residents who'd once crossed the street, rather than make eye contact with a leather vest, now riding together in a procession that stretched for miles along the same highway where 2,500 motorcycles had once arrived to save a widow from losing everything. The ride raised funds for disaster relief. It raised funds for veterans struggling with PTSD, inspired directly by Danny's continued recovery and his willingness to speak publicly about the panic attack Emily had helped him through in that cramped underground shelter. It raised funds for scholarships supporting children like Lily growing up in families rebuilding after natural disasters. You started something that's never going to stop growing, Sarah told Emily during the third annual ride, watching Lily, now a confident 8-year-old, race excitedly between motorcycles greeting bikers she'd grown to know as family over the years. I didn't start anything, Emily said, watching the endless procession of riders with the same wonder she'd felt every year since the first. I just opened a door. Emily, Sarah said, laughing gently, at what point are you going to stop saying that like it wasn't the single bravest thing any of us has ever witnessed? Emily considered the question seriously, watching the diner bustling behind them, ranchers sharing tables with truck drivers, police officers laughing alongside veterans, bikers and locals indistinguishable now in their easy familiarity with one another. Maybe never, she admitted. Maybe some things are supposed to stay simple in your own memory, even when they turn into something enormous for everyone else. Titan, overhearing the exchange as he approached with 2 plates of food, smiled knowingly. She's been saying that same thing for 3 years now, he told Sarah. Woman refuses to accept she did anything extraordinary, even with 4,000 motorcycles parked outside proving otherwise. Maybe extraordinary just felt like the obvious choice at the time, Emily said, accepting the plate Titan offered. Doesn't make it less extraordinary, just makes it feel less complicated in hindsight. That's usually how the important choices work, Titan said, settling into the seat beside her, the same easy companionship that had grown steadily between them over the years, evolving into something neither of them had expected, but both had quietly come to treasure. Feels simple when you're doing it, only looks complicated looking back. Emily glanced around the crowded diner at the plaque near the entrance that still read, "Kindness is never wasted," at the community that had formed around a single desperate decision made during the worst 30 seconds of her life, and felt something settle deep in her chest, not just gratitude, not just healing, but a hard-won understanding that had taken a tornado, 2,500 bikers, and years of rebuilding to fully arrive at. Every storm eventually passes. What people choose to do in the middle of it, that's what determines everything that comes after. Emily Carter had opened one door during the worst 30 minutes of her life, convinced she had nothing left to lose. She had been wrong. She'd had everything left to gain, and thousands of strangers who became family were living proof that when the world tries to tear someone apart, sometimes the bravest, most unexpected people are the ones who show up to help put it all back together, stronger, larger, and infinitely more beautiful than it had ever been before. And that, more than any storm, more than any tornado, more than any headline or stereotype ever could, was the truth that outlasted everything.